You never really think about how many card games are out there until people start asking you to talk about them. Hey kids, welcome back to the channel. I am Uncle Frank and I hope that you are having a great day. Today I wanted to sit down, have a relaxing conversation about one of my favorite TCGs, Flesh and Blood, and just give my overall thoughts on the game as it is now compared to when I started and where I think it's going to be going in the future. So if that's the kind of conversation you're in for, then sit back and let's get started. For those of you who don't know, Flesh and Blood is a TCG that came out in 2019, I think. And it's been fairly successful ever since. And it's one of the TCGs that people turn to when they're sick of Magic the Gathering, because similar to Magic, it is a fantasy-based trading card game with its own world lore, which makes it really appealing to someone like me who is a huge Magic story fan. So when Magic starts getting rough, I turn to Flesh and Blood because Flesh and Blood has a lot of what I crave, you know? It's got great card art, it's got good lore, it's got its own world, all that great stuff that you just kind of want in a game like Magic. It's just that Flesh and Blood feels like it's doing it better. Now, while I have played with some of the earlier cards, I did not get into Flesh and Blood when it first came out. I only got into it around the time of Uprising. My brother actually had brought me along to a pre-release, and he just wanted to see if I would like it. I ended up really liking it, and I've been playing it ever since. Now, my first thoughts on Flesh and Blood were that it's just another fantasy TCG that happens to just have some of the mechanics I really like. It's got a character selection system with the hero thing. It's got a really cool combat chain that I really think is... I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's one of the most perfect that I've ever played with. And it's hard to kind of describe without comparing it to other card games, but basically the Flesh and Blood combat chain is really smooth and gives you a lot to think about in terms of how you're going to not only attack your opponent, but defend against your opponent's attacks. There's so much intricacy to it that I was kind of overwhelmed at first, but as I played it more and more, I found myself kind of getting addicted to thinking about what I was going to do in any given turn. As I said before, I also fell in love with the Flesh and Blood lore. The world of Wraith is great. Most of the characters I've seen from the Flesh and Blood story have been really enjoyable to read about. I do wish that there was more lore going on. After all, most of Flesh and Blood's lore is in short stories. But besides that, I just overall think the lore is great. The other thing that I fell in love with early on was the cold foils. Flesh and Blood has one of the best foils of any card game. A cold foil Flesh and Blood card just looks so beautiful, so crisp, that I absolutely fell in love with them, and even now I buy any cheap cold foils I see on the secondary market just because I think they're absolutely beautiful. Now, when I started playing Flesh and Blood, I kind of considered it a niche fringe TCG, and I didn't think it was going to get a lot of traction. I thought it was going to go the way of a lot of other trading card games have throughout the last few decades. However, since then, the more I play it and the more I interact with the Flesh and Blood community, the more convinced I become of the game's staying power. I firmly believe now that Flesh and Blood is going to be here for the long haul. I think of any of the trading card games I've played in the last few years, this one has the best core mechanics, the best design philosophy, and one of the most positive and uplifting communities I've ever interacted with, which, in case you don't know, that can go a long way. It doesn't matter how good your card game is. If the people you play with are jerks, you're not going to want to play that card game. But with Flesh and Blood, even at some of the biggest tournaments I've ever gone to for Flesh and Blood, the worst people I've ever interacted with have been the judges, and that's just how it is. Judges are jerks regardless of card game, you know? So for it to be not only a good game with some really great cards that you can collect, but for it to also have a really cool community makes it really appealing to me. And it, again, goes a long way to solidifying that idea that I think 10 years from now, Flesh and Blood is still going to be here. Now, the world ain't all sunshine and rainbows, so while I don't have any complaints about Flesh and Blood, I do have some concerns that I want to get off my chest. And one of them is the story. As I had said previously, the story for Flesh and Blood it's very bare bones. I feel like for each set release, we get very little of world building and story, snippets, some short stories here and there, but never anything that feels really substantial, you know? And I want to stress that I don't feel like this is necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it really leaves me wanting more. And I would never ask LSS to sacrifice their game design and the quality of the sets that come out for story. In fact, if it came down to a choice between releasing a good set or releasing a set with a great story, I would always, 100%, every single time, choose to just have a good set and sacrifice the story entirely. It's just, you know, a small thing I desire would be more, perhaps, of the Flesh and Blood lore, and for us to just get a, not necessarily bigger story, but something that's more kind of enthralling to follow. The other thing I'm kind of concerned about is it's not necessarily power creep, because Yu-Gi-Oh! Has power creep that's disgusting. It's really hard to keep up with the new stuff if you're playing with older cards. Magic has power creep. They keep trying to force modern rotation after all. I'm not worried about power creep for Flesh and Blood because I feel like LSS does a pretty good job at balancing out their cards. But what I am worried about is complexity creep. You see, as I had said before, I did fall in love with the battle step and all the things you have to think about on the stack, kind of, and how you choose to deal with the chain as you're either blocking or attacking can really go a long way to affect future turns. And I still feel that way. I still absolutely love the complexity Flesh and Blood has now, but I feel like Flesh and Blood is a game that has the potential to become really complex. There's a lot of what I feel is unexplored design space currently, and if LSS is not careful, some of that unexplored design space can get really out of hand real quick. Maybe not necessarily in terms of power, but in terms of overall game complexity, to the point where I feel like it might gatekeep some of the newer people who might be interested in the game. They might see the game and they might see some of the action that's going on in even a casual setting, and if it's too complex, potential players might just go, no, that's not for me. Now, again, I'm not saying that that will happen. It's just a concern I have for the potential future. But besides that, those small concerns, I think Flesh and Blood is great. I absolutely love it. I play it more than Magic. I collect it more than Magic. And I'm more interested in what the future for Flesh and Blood holds than I am for Magic. And if there was one game on the market that I would consider to be part of the new big three, it would be Flesh and Blood. And that's not just my word for it. Flesh and Blood as a card game continues to grow. Every time I go to a bigger tournament for Flesh and Blood callings, they're called, crowd sizes seem to get bigger each and every time. And it's absolutely insane to see the kinds of people who turn out to these bigger events, because there's so much energy, there's so much optimism and positivity, and it always feels like more is coming. It always feels like the crowds are going to get bigger next time. And I'm going to be going to some conventions and events next year that are hosting Flesh and Blood, and I'm curious to see if I'm right and the crowds are going to be bigger, because it feels like they're going to be, because there's just so much cool stuff in this card game to collect. There's so many cool decks to play. And again, like I said earlier, this community is just so great that I feel like it's going to attract a lot of the people who've been disenfranchised with certain other TCGs. That's really all I have to say on the subject for now. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, hitting that notification bell, leaving a comment, and leaving a like, because for every like this video gets, I will be doing a push-up in the next one. My previous video didn't have me doing any push-ups, so I won't be counting that one, but I will be continuing from the one before it, if you're curious for how I'm doing these videos chronologically. So, all you got to know is this video's likes will count towards the next video's push-ups. So I'll see you guys then. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day. My previous video got 35 views, so I'll do this in batches. That's 20. And that makes 35.